Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, Latinx friends, Facebook friends, and to the network out there. Thank you so much for being a part of today's discussion. As you may know, I'm just now back in action. I've been out of commission for about a week with a little bit of campaign trail pneumonia, and it's a real honor to be getting back in the saddle here with my favorite Facebook live stream with the Latinx Network. So thank you so much for being a part of this. And as you know, today we're talking about some really important issues for the Latinx community, for the immigrant community, and for human rights and social justice. And that is U.S. policies towards Latin America in particular. So I'm assisted today by my friend and neighbor, Lisa Avital Pierce, and I want to give a big thank you to Lisa for coming out on very short notice to help out today. So, Lisa, go ahead. Let's hear your questions.
Okay, we have a question from Max from Florida, and he writes, "We have seen the violence and refugee crisis that U.S.-sponsored military coups have created in Central America, especially in El Salvador and Honduras. Recently, John Negroponte, a Republican who was ambassador in Honduras during the Reagan-backed Contras and director of national intelligence during George W. Bush endorsed Hillary Clinton, an orchestrator of the '09 Honduran coup. As the son of a Honduran immigrant who deeply cares about the country, I'd like to know how you would ensure that other democratically elected governments don't go through the same fate as Honduras."
Thank you so much for that very important question. And sadly, what happened in Honduras is, not unusual for U.S. interventions, which are sometimes CIA coups, which are sometimes military interventions, and sometimes just support for corporate and military coups. And that appears to be what happened in Honduras, that the State Department from the U.S. under Hillary Clinton gave the thumbs up for this military and corporate coup, which then ushered in this incredible period of violence, which still continues. The U.S. recognized the coup government and continued to support it. So, number one, under a Green administration in the White House, we would stop violating international law. We would stop violating U.S. law, which in fact says that there cannot be support for governments that are violating human rights. So we would immediately terminate all support and relationships with the illegal Honduran coup government. That includes ending the security and military assistance. And furthermore, as an overarching policy, a Green administration would support the use of international law globally, and in particular by the United States. So that means we would no longer have this impunity with which to take over other governments or support their overthrow, except when we ourselves are under imminent threat of invasion or otherwise danger on our shores. So you can be assured that under a Green administration there would be no support for the likes of the Honduran coup. Thank you so much.
Now we have a question from Angela from California. In response against the hundreds of thousands murdered and disappeared by the Mexican government in the last decade, the Zapatistas recently announced that they will be forming a council nominating an indigenous woman for presidency in 2018. Will your administration support this decision by showing solidarity with the indigenous people of Mexico?
So let me just say across the board, we should be showing solidarity with the indigenous people of Mexico, regardless of whether they are fielding a candidate or not. If they do field a candidate, we would be very disposed to supporting a non-corporate candidate of the people, as an indigenous candidate would certainly be. As you know, in Ecuador, the first indigenous president was elected I'm sorry, in Bolivia, not in Ecuador, in Bolivia, where an indigenous person was elected, whose name I should know. Sorry, I'll have it in 1 second. Morales, Evo Morales, of course. And under Morales, some very important things have happened, including the Cochabamba People's Summit, which supported for the first time a global agreement and promoted a global agreement to support the rights of Mother Earth as part of achieving a climate plan to rescue the climate. And this actually acknowledges the rights of Mother Earth to protect ecosystems, to have Mother Nature and rivers and forests and oceans, etc., protected as entities in their own right, which is a very important kind of legal breakthrough and something that should be supported and studied really on a much broader level. But it gives you an example of the kinds of things that are possible under an indigenous government that is not taking marching orders from corporate America. So we would be very favorably disposed. This would be a very important alternative to what we see happening, for example, in Mexico right now, under the Peña Nieto government, and also under the Calderon government that preceded it. There were enormous human rights violations, over 150,000 people who've been killed, some 27,000 who've been disappeared, thousands have been tortured, and incredible human rights violations have been documented by the likes of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. These governments, by the way, have been very close to Hillary Clinton and to the Democratic administration who've been in power during those Mexican governments. So we would represent a very dramatic departure from that kind of systemic abuse and would be very supportive of a people's government that is not under the thumb of abusive corporations.
Okay. Sergio from California asks, most people know that the legalization efforts for marijuana in the U.S. have led to a decline in that mass business in Mexico, but now it has been replaced with the opium market. What are your thoughts on blanket legalization of drugs in the U.S., and what other solutions would you offer to the drug war violence in Mexico?
So for starters, we need to end the war on drugs, which has been such a human rights disaster, has caused so much violence and death, and has been incredibly expensive, costing tens of billions of dollars. So that needs to end across the board. And as a medical doctor, I would be very clear that we need to address drug problems as public health problems, not as criminal problems. For starters, we need to legalize marijuana, to tax it and regulate it, and through that end of prohibition, we would end the biggest dangers and threats to public safety and health that come from the violent, illegal underground culture. It's time to begin exploring other forms of at least decriminalization and potentially legalization as well. We should, for example, undertake specific experiments in various cities, particularly on the treatment of heroin and other opioids, so that instead of having so many deaths from overdoses, instead what's been found in Europe when they established these methadone maintenance treatment centers, what they found was that when they actually provided either methadone or heroin to be sold and administered actually at the clinic, what they found was that people began to get their lives together and then began to get off of the drugs, off of the heroin or the opioids, so that it actually became not a form of maintenance, but actually a form of treatment that allowed people to pull together their jobs and their housing and their relationships. And of course, these centers of treatment are also centers for providing social services. So we need to begin that kind of experiment in this country, following the lead in Europe that has been so successful, and begin to explore much broader legalization. But even before we get there, we need to stop the war on drugs, stop funding that war on drugs south of the U.S. border that has created so much violence in our country and in Mexico and the countries of Central and South America.
So the following questions are being asked by the members of the Latinx Initiative. The first one is, most Latinos and therefore most Latino voters are of Mexican, Chicano, or Mexican American descent. Yet you hear nothing about the crisis in Mexico in the campaign. Why do you think that is, and what will you, as president, do about that?
So again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the current government, the Peña Nieto government, and the Calderon government in Mexico, under which there have been such massive human rights violations, torture, disappeared, 150,000 people killed. These governments have been very much in collaboration with the U.S. Government, with the White House, with the Obama administration, with the Hillary Clinton Secretary of State Department, and the Clintons have actually been very close to these governments as well. So we would not be continuing in that policy. We would not be protecting these governments. They should be held accountable for their human rights abuse.